The whole town was watching when Thomas Whitfield walked into Eli Proctor's office on a Tuesday afternoon in the spring of 1882, set a leather satchel on the desk, and paid Clara Donovan's debt in full, in cash, in front of 3 witnesses. Clara was not in the room when it happened. She heard about it 20 minutes later from the woman who ran the dry goods counter, who had it from the clerk at the land office, who had been one of the witnesses standing against the back wall when Thomas Whitfield opened the satchel and counted out the amount without drama or negotiation, as if he had already decided the terms before he walked through the door and was simply completing an errand he had planned in advance. By the time Clara had heard about the payment, she had also heard the part that came immediately after it. Thomas Whitfield had paid the debt, shaken Proctor's hand in a way that indicated the transaction was complete and not subject to revision, walked out of the office, and asked to see Clara Donovan. She found him standing in the street outside the feed store. He was holding his hat. He was looking at her the way a man looks at someone when he has thought carefully about what he is about to say and has decided he is prepared to stand behind it regardless of how it lands. He said, "I'd like to offer you a different arrangement, if you're willing to hear it." Clara Donovan was 27 years old, and she was not a woman who made decisions about her own life casually or permitted other people to make them for her, without requiring a complete accounting of what was being proposed and what was being left out. She had spent 8 months watching Eli Proctor use her father's debt as an instrument of pressure, and she understood the mechanics of arrangements made in her name without her consent better than she had wanted to learn them. She said, "What kind of arrangement?" He said, "A legal one. You'd be my wife on paper, which removes Proctor's claim entirely. You'd have your own room, your own authority over the household, and nothing from me that you don't ask for." She looked at him for a long moment. The street was not empty. She said, "And what do you want from it?" He said, "For Proctor not to win." So why did she say yes to a man she did not know on the basis of terms she had every reason to distrust, in a street full of people watching to see what she would do? Because the alternative had a deadline attached to it that was running out, and because a man who, when asked what he wanted, said he wanted something other than her, was at minimum saying something different than what she had been hearing for 8 months. Whether it was true was a different question, one she could not answer yet. But it was different. She said, "I'll hear the rest." This story does not start in that street. It starts with a debt that was never really about money. Clara's father had borrowed from Eli Proctor the previous winter when the cattle were sick and the feed bills were not, and he had died before the spring arrived. He left Clara the ranch and the debt in equal measure, and if the debt had been a straightforward financial obligation, it would have been difficult, but manageable. The problem was that the debt was not straightforward. Proctor had been circling the outstanding balance for 8 months, allowing the interest to compound in ways that the original terms had not clearly prohibited, so that by February of 1882, the amount owed had grown from something difficult into something that the ranch, managed by a single woman without her father's contacts and relationships, could not realistically retire. Clara understood this. She had gone through the numbers more times than was useful, from every angle she could find, and arrived at the same place every time. Proctor had offered his solution in January, presented as if he were doing her a favor, which she noted and stored away as information about his character. The solution was a marriage to his associate, a man named Garrett, who was in his 50s, and who had the particular quality of a man who has acquired everything he possesses through the resources of people with more power than him, and has never had occasion to develop any qualities of his own. The marriage would transfer the debt to Garrett, the debt would be retired, and Clara would have the legal standing of a wife and the practical situation of someone who had exchanged one form of dependence for another that was more thoroughly institutionalized. She refused twice. The third time, Proctor gave her a deadline of 2 weeks. Clara had not slept a full night since January. This is not a detail that the story requires for drama. It is a detail that tells you what 8 months of watching a situation deteriorate toward an outcome you have refused to accept actually does to a person. She knew the deadline was real. She knew the options available to her within that deadline. She had gone through every one of them twice, from every angle she could find, and eliminated them in order until the options that remained were not options in any useful sense of the word. She was not afraid. She was out of time, which is a different and in some ways worse condition, because fear at least gives you something to push against. Thomas Whitfield had been watching this develop from outside it for 2 months. He was 40 years old, a widower of 4 years, quiet in a way that the town of Briar Falls had decided meant cold, which is the interpretation a small community tends to place on reserve when it does not understand the reason for the reserve. His wife had died of fever in the winter of 1878. He had grieved privately and without performance, which the town read as a failure to grieve, because grief that does not announce itself is easy to miss from the outside. He had simply continued to work, and the work had been his answer to most things for 4 years. And it had not been the wrong answer for a man in his specific situation. He had built his ranch into the most consistently productive operation in the county through patience, genuine competence, and the willingness to work harder than anyone watching without performing the working for an audience. He paid close attention to things that mattered. He did not pay attention to things that didn't. He had watched Clara Donovan refuse Eli Proctor twice at increasing personal cost, and he had understood what he was watching. He was watching a woman who knew exactly what was being asked of her and was not going to agree to it regardless of what the refusal cost, which is a specific kind of integrity that is rare enough that when you see it clearly, you tend to remember it. After 2 months of watching, he made a decision that he then spent 3 days verifying from every angle before he walked into Proctor's office on that Tuesday afternoon. The wagon ride from Briar Falls to the Whitfield Ranch took 40 minutes. Clara spent it conducting the accounting she always did when she had been placed in a position she had not chosen, identifying every assumption she was making, testing each one against the available evidence, and arriving at the conclusions the evidence actually supported rather than the ones she would have preferred. The available evidence was this: Thomas Whitfield had retired a substantial debt on her behalf with no prior arrangement. He had offered legal protection with terms that, as stated, asked nothing of her. He had not, in the 40 minutes she had spent in his company, said anything she could identify as a lie. What she could not yet determine was whether Thomas Whitfield was exactly what he appeared to be, or whether he was a more sophisticated version of the thing she had been watching Proctor operate for 8 months. She did not assume she already knew. She was going to find out. When they arrived at the ranch, Thomas walked her through the house without preamble. Her room, which was the main bedroom, furnished simply and cleanly. The kitchen, the front room with the household desk in the corner, where the accounts were kept in 4 ledgers organized by year. The view of the east pasture from the window that ran along the south wall. He said, "The guest room is mine. The household accounts are yours to manage if that suits you, and if it doesn't, we can find another arrangement. I want you to have real authority here, not the appearance of it." Clara said, "Why?" He looked at her. "Because you'll know the difference between the two, and so will I. And I would rather not have a conversation in 6 months about why the arrangement felt like something it wasn't." She went to bed that first night with the alert watchfulness of someone waiting for the other shoe. She had organized her understanding of the situation around the certainty that the terms he had described were the opening position and that the actual position would reveal itself in time. She had been through enough arrangements in her father's dealings and in the Proctor situation to know that the terms stated at the outset were a kind of prologue and not the complete text. She waited. A week passed, then 2. The door to the guest room stayed closed. At meals, Thomas spoke when he had something to say, and did not fill the silence with conversation for its own sake. which she noted as a quality she had not expected and did not immediately know what to do with. She had expected either the pressure of a man who had paid for something and was waiting to collect, or the performance of a man who wanted her to think well of him. Thomas appeared to be neither. He appeared to simply be what he was, which was a man running a ranch and having meals in his own kitchen with no visible agenda beyond the one he had already stated plainly in the street. The terms did not change. Pay attention to what happened on her third day, because it explains everything that comes after. Thomas brought the household accounts to the kitchen table and walked her through the ledger system without simplifying it or presenting a selected version of it that was appropriate for her to see. He showed her 4 years of complete accounts, income entries, expenditure entries, the decisions he had made that he was not certain about, which he had flagged with a small mark in the margin of the relevant entry. He flagged his own uncertain decisions in his own records and showed them to her without being asked. She spent 2 days going through the ledgers before she made any decisions. On the third day, she identified a supply arrangement for feed grain that had been consistently overpriced for 2 years because no one had taken the time to compare it against the alternative suppliers in the county. She brought the comparison to Thomas at supper and put it on the table in front of him. He studied it for a moment. He said, "That's right. Can you write the letter to the alternative supplier?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Then do it. Your signature on the household accounts is sufficient." She wrote the letter. The new arrangement saved the household $30 over the following quarter, which was a specific and verifiable number, not a general improvement, but a documented one. Thomas noted the entry in the ledger with her initials in his handwriting beside it. She noticed this. She did not comment on it for 2 weeks. When she did comment, it was not a question. She said, "You're keeping a record of what I contribute." He said, "It's your work." She said, "You don't need to document it for your own purposes." He said, "It's not for my purposes." She sat with this. The documentation was for her, a record of her own contribution to a household that the town of Briar Falls considered entirely his, held in the official ledger in his handwriting, because there was no other ledger that anyone would consult. He was making sure the record existed because he understood that without it, the record would show only his name on everything. Something in Clara's accounting of the situation began to shift. Not quickly. She was a woman who revised her positions only when the evidence required it, which is the more important quality when you are in a situation that punishes premature trust. But she was also a woman who revised when the evidence required, which is not a quality everyone who prides themselves on caution actually has. She hired a new hand for the spring planting without asking Thomas first, because the authority he had described was either real or it was not, and she had decided to test it with a decision that mattered. She told him at supper that evening what she had done, what she had agreed to pay the man, and why she had chosen him over the other 2 who had inquired. Thomas listened through all of it. He said, "What made you choose him over the man from the alderman place?" She explained her reasoning in detail. He nodded when she was done. He said, "That's a good reason." That was all he said. The hand she had hired turned out to be exactly as competent as she had assessed him to be, which was useful information in itself, because it confirmed that her judgment about people was reliable in this context and could be trusted for future decisions. She had been on the ranch for 2 months when a legal letter arrived from Proctor's representative addressed to her. Thomas brought it in from the post without opening it and set it on the kitchen table in front of her, because it was addressed to her name. She read it twice. It was a formal and professionally drafted notice that the debt had been legally retired and that Proctor's firm had no further claim on any property associated with Clara Donovan Whitfield. Final. Sealed. Drafted with the kind of specificity that closes every available avenue for future interpretation. She looked up from the letter. She said, "You had a lawyer make this final." He said, Proctor looks for openings. I didn't want him to have one. She said, "This closes every opening." He said, "That was the intention." She looked at the letter again. Then she said, "You have no leverage left." He said, "I wasn't looking for leverage." She set the letter down carefully. She sat in silence for a moment, the specific silence of someone conducting an accounting that is arriving at a conclusion different from the one they started with, and is taking the time to verify the conclusion before accepting it. Then she said, "I don't understand you." He said, "What specifically?" She said, "Specifically, I don't understand why a man who did what you did in Proctor's office would make sure afterward that he had no advantage from it." He considered this for a moment, not performing consideration, but actually doing it. The way a man considers something when the question is one he wants to answer accurately rather than conveniently. He said, "Because if there was an advantage in it, the thing I did would be a different thing. And I wanted to do the specific thing I did, not the version of it that comes with conditions attached." Clara went back to the kitchen accounts that evening and sat at the desk for a long time without working on them. She was thinking about the letter, and the ledger with her initials, and the hand she had hired, and the 40 minutes in the wagon from Briar Falls during which Thomas Whitfield had not said a single thing she could later identify as either a performance or a lie. She was thinking about 4 months of terms that had not changed, and a door that had not opened uninvited, and a man who had removed his own advantage from the situation and then explained why in a sentence that did not require her to do anything with it except understand it. She thought about all of it from several angles. The way she thought about ledger problems that had more variables than they initially appeared to. And she arrived at a conclusion that was different from the one she had organized her first 4 months around. The conclusion was this: Thomas Whitfield was exactly what he had appeared to be from the beginning. She had simply not believed that was possible, which was not his failure. It was the reasonable result of her experience of the available alternatives. In October, 4 months after the wagon ride from Briar Falls, Clara walked to Thomas's door in the evening after supper. She knocked. He opened the door and looked at her. He did not say anything. He was a man who understood when to wait, and he waited. She said, "I think I would like to not sleep alone tonight." He said, "That is your choice to make." She said, "I know. That's why I'm making it." He stepped back from the door. She came in. There is a thing Clara Donovan understood about herself that evening that she had not understood clearly before. She understood that choosing something freely, for no reason other than that you want it, because the situation is genuinely safe, and the person in it is genuinely what they appear to be, is a specific and different experience from all of the alternatives. She had not had the conditions for that experience in a very long time. She recognized it now that she had it. The town of Briar Falls formed its usual opinions about the Whitfield marriage in the months that followed. The general view was that Thomas had done something impulsive that had likely not resolved the way he imagined, which is the view frontier towns tend to form about arrangements they cannot see the interior of. They saw what was visible from the outside, a rancher who had paid a debt and acquired a wife from it. What they could not see from the outside was a woman who had come to a decision freely, with full information, at a pace that was entirely her own. The Whitfield Ranch produced its best 5 consecutive years between 1882 and 1887. Thomas attributed this to the supply arrangements and the 2 hands Clara had hired in the spring. Clara attributed it to the fact that both of them made decisions from the same ledger, and neither of them flagged the other's uncertain calls in the margin without telling them first. The debt that Eli Proctor had used to try to determine the shape of Clara Donovan's life was retired permanently, legally, and without conditions in the spring of 1882. The ledger from those years, which Clara maintained until the end of her life, has her initials beside every entry she contributed, in Thomas's handwriting, going back to the first week. In the spring of 1883, she added his initials beside one entry from October of the previous year. He never asked her why. She never offered an explanation. They both understood which entry it was. The street where Thomas had stood with his hat in his hands and offered her a different arrangement is still there, in what Briar Falls became over the years that followed. Clara walked it sometimes, after everything, and stood in the approximate place where he had stood, and thought about the question she had asked him and the answer he had given her. What do you want from it? For Proctor not to win, she had thought at the time that this was either the most honest thing she had ever heard from a man in that kind of situation, or the most carefully constructed deflection. It turned out to be neither, because it turned out to be simply true. And simply true is a category of answer she had not been able to readily identify in the years before that street, in that spring, with a man holding his hat and prepared to stand behind what he said. She recognized it now. She recognized it clearly enough that she walked back to the ranch from that street every time, which was the most complete form of recognition available to her.